All right, so without further ado, we're excited to be welcoming Stuart Reid. He is an executive editor of Foreign Affairs. He has written for The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Washington Post, Bloomberg Business Week, Political Magazine, Slate, and other publications. This, his first book, The Lumumba Plot, looks at the fascinating story of Congo's independence from Belgium and all that happens in the fallout. From mutinies to assassination attempts to coups in what would be a horror story for locals in the decades that followed, but for the US government, a playbook from which to read for future interventions. Reid will be in conversation with Elizabeth Routh, and she is the editor of Politico magazine. So please join me in welcoming Stuart Reid and Elizabeth Routh.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here today.
Thanks
we
for
will
coming.
have time, as the opening remarks said, we will have time for questions. So think about them as we have our discussion, and then I'll prompt you a little bit further as we get closer to that time. So Stuart, why don't you start off with what drew you to this story in the first place?
Sure. So it begins, funnily enough, with Politico magazine. In 2014, I wrote an article about Russ Feingold, who was going to Congo because he had been appointed as a diplomat by the Obama administration after losing his Senate seat. And the article was really about sort of an interesting post-Senate career, but it involved traveling to Congo. And I was instantly taken with the place when going there, and then started reading up on its history. And the more I read, the more I realized there was this great untold story about its traumatic birth as an independent nation. And it was the big Cold War crisis of the summer of 1960. It was on the front page of the New York Times every day, but I knew basically nothing about it and had never been taught about it. So I kept digging.
So why don't you, for us, just run us a little bit through the basics? What happened after independence?
So everything went downhill very quickly. Congo became independent from Belgium on June 30th, 1960. And then within days, a bunch of bad things happened. The army mutinied, which had an all-white officer corps, which was a holdover from colonialism, which was not surprisingly not too popular among the black rank and file. The Belgian military intervened with paratroopers across the country, ostensibly to protect its citizens, but it looked like a recolonization. The mineral-rich province of Katanga announced its secession. And then, so as the prime minister of the country, Patrice Lumumba, who my book's largely about.
Who was at the time
34,
34.
About to turn 35. He's watching his country fall apart before his very eyes. And so he calls on the United Nations, which sets up the first massive peacekeeping operation in its history.
So the UN comes in, and does it help?
To a certain extent, but not to Lumumba's satisfaction, because it doesn't bring the secessionist province of Katanga back into the fold. Its troops aren't allowed to enter that place, where Lumumba himself can't enter. So he then visits the US, including Washington, D.C. First, he's in New York asking the Secretary General of the UN, Dag Hammarskjöld, for help. That meeting, those series of meetings fail. He goes to D.C., wants to meet with Eisenhower. Ike is out of town, and sort of has this frustrating meeting at the State Department, and goes back home to Congo after having sort of had a failed visit to America.
And so he then appeals to, at the time, the U.S.'s arch enemy, right?
Yeah. So Lumumba makes a fateful decision to ask the Soviets for military aid. And that really sets off alarm bells in Washington, especially in the CIA.
One of the things that I was so struck by reading this book was the extent to which the U.S. went to influence internal affairs in Congo at the time. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So after they see that Lumumba has made worrisome appeals to the Soviet Union, worrisome in the American officials' view, this fear develops that Congo is going to turn communist. And the station chief in Congo writes this cable saying that the country's experiencing a classic communist takeover, is how he puts it. And so there's this meeting at the White House on August 18th, 1960, where President Eisenhower has something to the effect, we don't know the exact words, they've been lost to history, something to the effect that Lumumba needs to be gotten rid of physically. And we know this because the note taker at the meeting remembered this clearly and testified before the church committee about this. And we also know this because of what happened next, which is that the CIA set in motion this sort of bizarre, almost out of a movie assassination plot involving poisons being flown to Congo that were supposed to be put in Lumumba's food or toothpaste.
Did it work?
It did not work. That plot sort of fizzled because Lumumba, by that point, was under house arrest. By that point, also, he had been overthrown in a coup by a man named Mobutu, who would later go on, as people may know, to rule the Congo for decades. So the poison plot fizzled out, but the U.S. did, in a different way, have a hand in Lumumba's death, and I'll just briefly explain that, which is that Lumumba's ousted from power, thrown under house arrest, decides to escape house arrest, manages to slip past the guards. He's then thrown in a military prison, and the timing is important here because that's December 1960. The Kennedy administration's on the way out, or excuse me, Eisenhower administration's on the way out. JFK is about to come in, and there's this real fear, which was a legitimate fear, both within the CIA and among Lumumba's Congolese enemies, that the Kennedy administration would take a less hardline stance against Mobutu, that it might try, against Lumumba, that it might try and engineer some sort of deal that would bring him back to power as prime minister. And so Mobutu decides to send him to a province where it's certain he will die. And he tells the CIA station chief this. And the CIA station chief, a man named Larry Devlin, does two things. One, he doesn't try and talk Mobutu out of this. In the context, that was a green light because they had a very collaborative relationship at the time. And two, he decides to keep headquarters in DC out of the loop because he rightly feared that they would tell him to put the brakes on this operation. At this point, Lumumba no longer needed to be killed in the Americans' eyes, and there were to be no big decisions as the transition took place. So on January 17th, 1961, Lumumba is flown to the breakaway province of Katanga, tortured the whole way, and then just hours after landing is shot dead by a Congolese firing squad answering to Belgian officers who were in turn answering to the secessionist government there.
Yeah. And then Mobutu, of course, went on to take absolute power with massive U.S. backing afterwards.
Yeah, and he stayed in power until 1997.
Wow. I want to talk first a little bit about your process for this, because obviously it involved a lot of archival research. I know you traveled to France, you traveled to Congo. What was that like, and how did that change your mind about the story along the way?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's massively inefficient. It's basically the thing that I found with archival research, in that you go to these archives like the Eisenhower Library, for instance, and you become a human scanner while you're in there, just trying to take as many photos as possible, and then months later sift through them. So to give you just one example of a cool thing I found, in the Eisenhower Library in Abilene, Kansas, that August 18th meeting I mentioned with Eisenhower, where he issues this order. Previously, all we had known about that meeting was the church committee testimony of the note taker, because he, as he testified, was told to not write anything down from the meeting. He heard this remark, it really struck him. There was an awkward silence after it. He stays silent. He doesn't write anything down about it. And so in the Eisenhower Library, I found these handwritten notes from a State Department official who was attending the meeting, and it had the word Lumumba and then a big black X next to it.
Whoa.
So we don't know that could mean a lot of different things, but it could also mean one particular thing.
Yeah, that's what it meant to you. So one of the things that I found intriguing in the book, just going back to independence for a second, was the different ways that the Congo was colonized as opposed to other countries in Africa. And there was a big education gap, in particular in Congo, which sort of set the country up for dysfunction later. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah. So the Belgians had this saying, no elites, no problems. And the idea was that if you prevented an indigenous political elite from forming, then no one would demand independence and you wouldn't have any problems. You'd have a placid population. The French and the British, the other big colonial powers in Africa, had a sort of slightly more realistic view that independence was eventually inevitable. In Congo in 1955, there was a plan called the 30-year plan, written by a Belgian academic. The idea being that by 1985, only then would Congo be ready to be independent. That was seen as a heretical, radical, way too fast idea at the time.
Wow.
30 years. In the late 50s, things changed very quickly, and Congo realized that it needed to offload its colony. Of course, it, as you said, like hadn't allowed for much education at all. And so that was one of the problems Congo faced upon independence, was that it had this political elite that was not, there were no Congolese lawyers, for instance. Whereas in British and French colonies, there were the equivalent.
So how does Lumumba himself fit into that? He's obviously wildly impressive, autodidact, massive reader, but had never gone to college, had been a postal employee, right? Tell us a little bit about him.
Yeah, I mean, his story is this fascinating rise from very humble circumstances. He was born in a small village, moved to the city of Stanleyville, which is now Kisangani, in his late teens, early 20s, and then joined the colonial administration as a postal clerk. Was arrested for embezzling from the post office, which
he was making like a fifth of what his white counterparts were making.
Yeah. And he, up until that point, he had really, allied himself with the colonial system, which was basically the only option for advancement at that time. He's thrown in jail, and then even in prison in 1956, he writes what in retrospect looks like a very moderate book manuscript, where his demands are not for independence at that point. It's for eventual, maybe quasi-independence with the Belgian king still remaining in charge. Partly that was strategic, of course, because he was still trying to curry favor with the administrative officials. But I think also it reflected a political evolution that was in progress. And only later, after he is freed from prison, becomes a beer salesman in the capital, and then starts linking up with other budding nationalists and traveling to other African cities as part of these Pan-African conferences. Only then does he become the Lumumba that would be capable of winning an election and leading his nation into independence.
So he does win an election. He becomes prime minister. There's a president as well. And then we get a very interesting sense of his leadership. He's very charismatic. He's a very good orator. He's also capricious, disorganized. I wonder if you could read a section of the book that kind of captures it for us.
Sure, and I'll keep this short. So this is in August 1960. Lumumba's just returned from his failed trip to the United States. The Prime Minister's office was the picture of disorder. Weeks of letters piled up in unopened mailbags. The tables were littered with bottles of beer and champagne. Clouds of cigarette smoke thickened the air, stirred lazily by a ceiling fan. Plastic flowers poked out of crystal vases. On the walls hung reproductions of Renoir, Braque, and Modigliani. On the floor stood a pair of elephant tusks and a piano, both inherited from the office's previous occupant, the Belgian Governor General. Gatekeeping was haphazard. An ambassador seeking an audience would be left waiting on the lawn outside, arms crossed, feet toying with a pebble, whereas other visitors came and went as they pleased, attracted not only by the chance to present any minor complaint or harebrained scheme to the Prime Minister, but also by the butlers serving free alcohol and sandwiches. Daily press conferences held in the garden were scheduled for 11, but usually didn't start until 1, leaving ample time for reporters to roam the grounds and help themselves to foie gras, cake, whiskey, beer, and champagne. The Prime Minister's wife, Pauline Pango, would regularly wander around, children in tow. 7-year-old Patrice Jr. had a knack for finding which of the many telephones was ringing at any given moment. 8-year-old Francois was less enthused about the crowds, annoyed that his home could be filled with as many as 100 grown-ups at a time. At the center of this chaos, amid the multiplying advisors, the accreting mounds of correspondence, the onslaught of telegrams, the reams of loose files, the stacks of newspapers, the clinking champagne flutes and beer glasses, the jangling telephones, the placard men shouting through the window, the questing journalists, the special envoys from nations far and wide, the jostling petitioners, the senators, governors, and party officials from this or that province or ethnic group, each with his own special plea or conspiracy theory, was Lumumba, still just 35 years old, overworked, overtired, and overwhelmed. He trusted no one. He typed most letters himself. He saw personally to the management of his residence's garage. At one point that summer, he spent several hours posing for his official portrait, waiting as photographers had legal books carted in from the Ministry of Justice and procured a flag from the army to form a suitable background. Propelled by a messianic belief in his historical destiny, "The Congo made me, I shall make the Congo," he liked to say, he worked at all hours.
Wow. So obviously he's in over his head to a degree. The UN comes in, but he also finds himself caught up in a geopolitical fight that is not his. And the US becomes, as you mentioned, the US becomes convinced that he's an ally of the Soviets. You said in the intro that that was the conventional wisdom about him. And was that a surprise for you as you were writing the book to realize the truth about him?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of two conventional wisdoms. I think the dominant idea at the time among Western officials and observers was that Lumumba was a communist stooge, either pro-Soviet or, as a slightly more sophisticated version of the critique had it, so erratic as to open himself up to Soviet influence. The other conventional wisdom that would take hold among the left after his death was that he was this sort of perfect martyr who was cut down purely due to colonial cruelty and made no mistakes himself. The truth, as is probably not surprising, is a little bit of both. That there were, he was not pro-communist or pro-Soviet, I think, but he did make a ton of mistakes that did, in their own way, lead to his downfall. Not that he deserved it, of course. But what did surprise me was he was more pro-American than I realized. He, for instance, when he visited DC, he actually asked for U.S. troops to be sent to Congo, which is hardly the plea of someone who is on the Soviet side.
Yeah. So he did come to DC. Could you tell us a little bit about that trip? We're here.
Sure. And you can read more about it in Politico magazine.
We did an excerpt of this part of the book. Yeah.
An excerpt. Where to start? So there were some highlights, I guess. He met Dave Chappelle's mother, who was 20 or so years old at the time, and Lumumba was looking for talent, American talent, specifically African American talent, to bring to Congo to help replace all the Belgians who had fled. So they met, and he tried to recruit her to come, and she didn't end up coming while he was alive.
He just gave her, as I recall, he just said you're coming, and then he was like, come on the plane with me tonight.
And that's how desperate he was for help. He would take all comers. There was also a much talked about afterwards tryst with a prostitute arranged by the CIA. That it had this sort of too good to check quality, but then I interviewed the State Department officer who was responsible for taking Lumumba around, and met him on the Upper West Side and interviewed him, and he recounted for me the story, which he had also told elsewhere before, and so that made it into the book.
Wow. Ultimately, so I was struck, the U.S. had this opinion about him from U.S. officers in Congo who really did not like him. I'm thinking of like, Devlin, the CIA, who had these very hardened attitudes about him early on, seemed much more drawn to Mobutu. Why was that? What did he sort of do wrong?
I think, so Lumumba, I say in the book that he was Congo's best politician and perhaps its worst statesman, and that the very qualities that made him so appealing to the masses, his charisma, his political sense and ability to pivot and triangulate, those rubbed Western officials the wrong way and were interpreted in the least favorable light possible. And so I think there was a real misjudging of him on the part of the US. As I said earlier, he inherently had a lot of pro-American attitudes, but they sort of couldn't see past that. As for why they went with Mobutu, I think a lot of that is sort of just contingency and historical happenstance. He was the one who was made head of the army effectively. And he sort of stepped into the void at this moment of stalemate in Congo and was encouraged by the CIA to take over, but had sort of was the right man at the right place. He also, his style was more, he had a way with Western diplomats and sort of knew how to assuage them, and in their eyes was seen as more reliable and responsible than the erratic Lumumba.
How soon after the trip to Washington was the assassination order given?
So the trip to Washington ended at like August 7th or something like that, or late July, early August, and then the meeting in the White House was August 18th, and then it didn't really get into motion until late August, early September. But everything, I mean, that's another thing that struck me. The whole Lumumba's, from his taking office to he was only in office for 2.5 months, and he died a little over 6 months after becoming prime minister. So it was all very compressed.
Wow. Mobutu and Lumumba have this intense relationship. Can you tell us a little bit about learning about that?
Yeah, so the story has a whole personal element to it and a betrayal, which is that Mobutu was Lumumba's sort of errand boy, protege, mentee. When Lumumba would travel to Brussels before independence, Mobutu would filter his correspondence and pick up books for him and that sort of stuff. Upon independence, Mobutu was made junior minister in the new government. And then after the mutiny, when Lumumba needed someone to help Africanize the army, he turned to Mobutu because Mobutu had spent 6 or 7 years in the army and sort of seemed like a natural choice. But a distance begins opening up between them. And when Mobutu first announces his coup, he says that he's neutralizing both Lumumba and the president at the time, sort of the two top politicians in Congo, and doesn't pick which one, and he's called the Hamlet of the Congo for his indecisiveness, and then ultimately, with much American encouragement, acts against Lumumba, and then that leads to when Lumumba was captured after escaping, Mobutu's sort of watching. You can see the newsreels to this day on YouTube where Mobutu's watching Lumumba get roughed up by soldiers and his hair pulled out and yanked around. So it was a real. Their relationship had this massive tragic arc to it. And then after Lumumba's death, Mobutu, sort of in the height of irony, tried to resurrect Lumumba's legacy and claimed that Lumumba was the victim of colonialist machinations. So it, has quite an odd trajectory.
Why do you think, why was Mobutu so primed to turn on Lumumba?
I mean, he was getting briefcases of American cash. That certainly helped. And I think he after not wanting power, he at a certain point wanted power and liked power. Yeah.
So another really interesting player in this whole book who I knew nothing about was Dag Hammarskjöld, the UN Secretary General. And you mentioned that I think he's widely regarded as one of the best Secretary Generals ever, right? And very powerful. Talk a little about him and sort of his role in geopolitics at the time.
Yeah. So I think readers of my book, I mean, I certainly experienced this writing it, will come away with a less favorable impression of him than they may have started with. So one of the things that's important to sort of wrap your head around is, at the time, the UN really was much more powerful and important than it is now. You know, what the UN Security Council did yesterday, there would be a front page story about it. It hadn't yet, it sort of hadn't yet fallen victim to the Cold War. It also was, 1960 was sort of the moment when it was opening up its membership, because there were, for instance, 17 new African countries that year. So the Congo Crisis is sort of the hinge point at which the old UN of the immediate post-war era sort of dies, and the new UN of, you know, fecklessness and crippled power that we know now is born. And what it in Congo, what was unique was it had sort of monitored ceasefires and truces before, but it had never sent, you know, over 10,000 peacekeepers to restore order to an entire country. And yeah, Hammarskjöld himself, I think, just as with many diplomats who met Lumumba, they did not see eye to eye. The Ghanaian ambassador to the UN thought that there was a racial element to this, and said that Hammarskjöld could not countenance an African trying to cross swords with him, or his words. So that may have been at play as well.
Yeah, so he waffles on Lumumba.
I mean, he turns against him pretty quickly, but I think what he waffles on is then on sort of broader policy of the Congo, he realizes he's gone a bit too far when the UN sort of accidentally endorses the coup that leads Lumumba to be ousted. Or accidentally is not even the right word.
So you would say the UN ended up a less powerful force because of what happened in Congo?
I think that's fair to say. It was a real, the Soviets regretted not vetoing the operation. It was seen as a failure at the time. It took a very long time for the UN to finally reintegrate Katanga, which it had to do by force in the end. Lumumba had been right about that. And I mean, it also led to the death of the Secretary General. So it was not a shining example of happy peacekeeping, I think.
Yeah, he died in a plane crash.
He did,
Yeah.
yes.
Also, what struck me is that it wasn't just a peacekeeping mission. It was, right? But the UN was really running the country to a certain extent, because the UN brought in all these bureaucrats that were like manning telecoms and things, right?
Yeah, so part of the chaos after independence was that there was this massive Belgian flight from the country. And because of the way the Belgian colonial system worked, that meant that you lost all of the elite who were actually running things. So the UN, part of its goal was to come in and sort of replace that with air traffic controllers and all sorts of technical experts.
So what I was interested in was Eisenhower, so gave the order, we think, right? Lumumba X. And as you write very well in the book, he was totally checked out at that point. He was like playing golf every afternoon, and he just sort of wanted to sort of rid himself of all these problems. He was also not sympathetic to Western anti-colonialism, right? Like to African anti-colonialism. He was more sympathetic to the Europeans. Then Kennedy comes in, who has this kind of different vision for Africa. And at a moment, there's sort of like a glimmer of hope, right? And then what goes wrong?
Yeah, so Kennedy campaigned more than one would expect on Africa as an issue. And his whole critique of Eisenhower was that the U.S. was failing to sufficiently ally itself with African nationalist aspirations across the continent, and that Eisenhower was sort of mishandling Africa. And in part, this was sort of a way to court African American votes without explicitly embracing civil rights, which would lose him the Southern Democrats. And so during the transition, there is this brief moment where there are signs from certain advisors in the Kennedy camp that it'll have a more enlightened policy towards Congo. What ends up happening is Lumumba dies 3 days before Kennedy even takes office. And so then the crisis transforms, and Kennedy was never able to sort of put in the strain of policy that one group of his advisors was advocating.
But he does end up fully behind Mobutu, right? And like
Exactly.
praises him, and he comes to the Rose Garden, and
Yeah, he fell in line quickly, and that would last from president to president up until really late George H.W. Bush, Clinton, somewhere around there, where there was sort of finally a distancing after the Cold War, of course.
Just a warning to the audience, in about 5 minutes we'll start questions, so get them prepared. So one of the I want to talk about like legacy of this incident for a little bit. First, for the Congo, what happened to the country because of this?
So I think you can draw a pretty straight line from the decisions made by the U.S. and by the CIA in 1960 to the dysfunction that followed. And the specific decision was to back Mobutu, not only in this key moment in 1960 where he is about to announce this coup and does so, but also continuing to support him throughout the years and decades that followed. So Mobutu takes charge at first sort of unofficially and behind the scenes de facto, and then in 1965 officially as president, and he runs the country into the ground. Basically, it's kleptocratic, repressive, completely hollowed out. And in 1996, 1997, it outright collapses, and there's an invasion, and led by a leader who got his start as someone sort of carrying on the legacy of Lumumba, and the country outright implodes, and so begins one of the biggest civil wars in recent memory. And things have gotten better, but far from perfect in the decades since that war.
And then what about the legacy for U.S. foreign policy? Do you see in any choices the country went on to make in the 60s the sort of seeds planted in Congo?
Yeah, I mean, so this obviously wasn't the first covert action. There was Iran and Guatemala in the 50s, also under Eisenhower. But Congo was the first where the victim of the coup that the U.S. supported was killed rather than, under house arrest or exile. And it was really viewed as a success within the U.S. government. Devlin, the station chief, was promoted for his work in the Congo. He won at least one award for it. And then you see the U.S. go on to do Bay of Pigs, to support unsavory regimes throughout the rest of the Cold War. So it wasn't a tactic that was invented in the Congo, but I think it was an early instance of it that really did provide because it was seen as a win, and in narrow Cold War terms, it sort of was. You got rid of this potentially pro-Soviet guy. You had a friendly pro-American military leader in power. What was not to like? But of course, only in the narrowest sense does that make sense, and that excludes long-term stability, the plight of the Congolese people themselves.
Was there any evidence that the Soviet Union was actually that interested in Congo? Like, was the U.S. fighting over anything?
No is the answer to your question. So if you read the cables at the time, the Americans thought the Soviets were extremely active and clever in Congo. With the opening of the Soviet archives after the Cold War, it turned out there was barely anything about Congo in there. They viewed it as a faraway place where were never going to have much influence. They could score some propaganda points on the floor of the UN Security Council, but it was not a place where they imagined being successful and having much interest. But you would never know that from reading the American correspondence.
There was a moment where the U.S. declines to give aid to Lumumba, right? And then you pan to Khrushchev, who's like, I don't understand what the U.S. is doing.
Yeah, he says, really, are the Americans that stupid?
Yeah. So one of the things that bring it to today, I think we're living in this era of misinformation, disinformation. Everything seems very hard to sift through. But I was amazed by the amount of disinformation, misinformation that was going on in Congo. It made me feel optimistic about today, frankly, which is hard to believe. But there were just no channels of communication. The plots against the various leaders were forgery. There were forgeries. There was propaganda. There was U.S. money, and nobody knew. And then you had a population who didn't know any of the truth. They barely knew what Lumumba looked like. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. And so, for instance, there were these letters that were circulated, supposedly written by Lumumba, that were pretty crude fakes, probably created by some Belgian enemy of Lumumba's. And they, it was a letter where Lumumba says, "Dear Khrushchev, I pledge my allegiance." Sort of silly thing, but like a lot of people took them seriously. Joe Alsop, the columnist, wrote a column about how, here's more evidence that Lumumba is a commie. So that was definitely a theme. And then also, though, the bad communications really did play a role. And I think the effect that had, most importantly, was that officials in the field had a lot of leeway. The U.S. ambassador to Congo, Claire Timberlake, the station chief, they could really run Congo policy because it was so, to be sending cables back and forth you couldn't micromanage anything.
And Devlin would send his cables at...
One anecdote I heard from his daughter is that he learned how to... He was an independent operator who liked to, freelance. And
this is a CIA
the CIA
operative.
Station chief. So he would write, "Will assume concurrence if I don't hear back by the end of the day," and he'd send these cables at 5 p.m. Although one time they called him on that bluff and sent an immediate reply back telling him not to do whatever the charge was.
Wow. And then the other thing that I think about today is we're in this very tense moment internationally. It seems like there's ever more conflict. Are there any lessons that we can take away from the Lumumba plot for today?
I mean, one of them would be not to make the mistake that American officials made at the time, which was to assume that your enemy is 10 foot tall and perfectly capable, when in fact they're often consumed by their own domestic troubles. So that, that obviously can apply in a way to China or Russia today. And then the other thing is, one failure I think America made was that it failed to let what was then called the Third World sort of chart its own course and go its own way and be apart from the great geopolitical rivalry of the day. And I think the implication today would be that we shouldn't worry too much about what is now called the global South. Which way are they voting on Ukraine? How exactly pro-American or pro-Chinese are they? Often these nations just want to have their own politics and develop their own way, and they don't want to be caught up in our rivalry, and nor should we make them be.
Interesting. Thank you. All right. And audience questions?
Sure.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, there's a microphone. Why don't you line up and then we'll do... Yeah. Would you like to go first?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So you mentioned that Lumumba was assassinated 3 days before JFK was sworn in. I read elsewhere that JFK didn't find out Lumumba had been assassinated for another 2 weeks. Is that true? And if that was kept from him, was it the CIA that kept the secret or someone else?
So one of the interesting things, and this actually goes back to Elizabeth's question about information at the time, is Lumumba was sent away to the province of Katanga, and no one outside the immediate group of people who was involved in his death really knew his fate. There were heavy suspicions that he died, but it was unclear, and the government of that secessionist province was sort of not revealing anything. And only in February did the world really find out. So the CIA knew that he had been transferred and wrote a cable that would actually become somewhat famous. It said, thanks for Patrice. If we knew he were coming, we would have baked a cake, which sort of is this jokey reference to this 50s song. So they knew he was transferred. I think a lot of people suspected he was dead because they knew he was so hated, but it wasn't officially confirmed until February.
Okay. And then there's a kind of a famous black and white photograph of JFK when he receives the bad news. Is that true? Is that when somebody told him, presumably in the White House?
So I have a footnote about this in the book, an endnote, which is that photo he has his hand over his face and sort of looking distressed. That has often been said to be the moment he learned Lumumba died, but it doesn't quite add up because JFK was learned about it when he was not in the White House. He was away at his country house in Virginia, and that photograph's in the White House. So maybe that was, a phone call about Lumumba later in the day or something, but that to the best of my research is not actually the moment where he learned
Artistic
of his
license. Thank you.
So 2 quick questions. Number 1, you haven't mentioned Alan Dulles. Was he involved in all of this? I mean, it sounds like him.
Yes, your intuition is correct. So when Eisenhower said these famous words, or we don't know what the words were, he looked directly at Alan Dulles, the director of the CIA. Dulles sort of didn't do anything for a week or so. And then there was this nudging from Eisenhower's national security advisor, Gordon Gray, basically saying like, remember that thing that the president said? Like, I'd like you to get working on that. And so then Dulles tells a man named Richard Bissell, one of his deputies, to get working on it. And then the plot is in motion from there.
And the second question is the description that you read of Lumumba's office and all the people in the garden and the beer and the tusks and all of that. You're too young to have been there. Where did all that information come from?
Yeah, so that, the book has extensive endnotes for any particular question, but so that one comes from a combination of, there was a book written by one of his allies and advisors, a Frenchman named Serge Michel, who was a pro-Lumumba person, but endlessly frustrated with him. And so that depiction comes from him. Plus there was a French journalist who wrote a book about her time in Congo. And then also United Nations cables at the time describing various meetings they had with Lumumba. So for any given paragraph, there are often a bunch of different sources, and I tried to, conceal that in the text, but have it be perfectly open and transparent in the endnotes.
Got it. Thank you.
So first question is directly about the book, and the second question is about the present. First question is, why was it a natural place to send Lumumba? Because if there's a civil war and Katanga is against the central government, they would kill Lumumba if they thought that Mobutu would be better for them as an independent province, right? Is it better?
So just to explain that a bit. So the idea was the Mobutu's illegal military regime in the capital hated Lumumba. He represented a threat to their very existence, but they wanted to outsource the dirty work. It would be too controversial, and they'd face too much sanction if they did the job themselves. So there were two choices of places to send them, which were the two secessionist states at the time. I've only mentioned one, Katanga, but there's another, South Kasai. And so the idea was, let's send him to a place where he's deeply hated. There's also an ethnic element in both destinations that at play. And so Moise Tshombe, the head of the secessionist government in Katanga, was an avowed enemy of Lumumba. So was even more so was his, one of his ministers. And so when Lumumba's flown there, he's tortured. Tshombe, the leader, even gets his suit stained with blood. So it was sort of a certain thing that, even though that province was still in opposition to the central government, they were united in their hatred of Lumumba.
Okay, and the second is about the present day. If the Tutsis of Rwanda were not involved in the Civil War, would the Civil War end?
What civil
Today's Civil War in Congo.
I honestly don't feel qualified to answer that question, but behind you is a man who is probably qualified to answer that. I don't want to wade too much into things I don't know about. Hi, Tony.
Thank you, Stuart. I'm not going to comment on that at all. But first of all, I want to thank you, and I haven't had a chance to get through your whole book yet, but I wanted to ask you about racism. Because it seems to me, and you talk about it in the early part of the book, the overt racism on the part of the Belgians, calling Lumumba a monkey, and that how prevalent this was in Belgian colonial language. It seems to me that the racism on the part of the Europeans in the United States is extremely important in understanding why some of these things occurred. So my question is, number one, do you agree? But also, what did you find in your research, perhaps particularly on the American side, but more broadly, about the kind of more overt racism that was sadly affecting these decisions?
Yeah, I mean, it was striking. So to give you a few examples, Eisenhower at a meeting, the head of his budget office was a man named Maurice Stans. And before Congolese independence in the spring of 1960, the topic comes up where they're discussing, okay, Congo is now going to become independent in a few months. And this man, Maurice Stans, jokes in this National Security Council meeting that, the Congolese are still in the trees. And Eisenhower sort of says something in apparent agreement. Another point, it's brought up that there are 80 different political parties in Congo. And Eisenhower says, oh, I didn't realize that many Congolese could read. Another example, the US ambassador to Congo, Claire Timberlake, is joking to a friend in a letter that Lumumba is a cannibal. So this was consistent, and I saw a lot of it. I think the way in which it really had an effect was that the Congolese were viewed as children, just as the Belgians had viewed them, which was the paternalism was their whole policy. And so if the Congolese are political children, then they need constant supervision and management and intervention. And so I think that was sort of the guiding logic of the American approach. It also, another way it manifested, I think, was that Congo was seen as an uncivilized place. Those are the words of Claire Timberlake again, where bad things just happened. Niceties like sovereignty and the Constitution were no match for the Darwinian law of the jungle in a place like Congo. And so that allowed the US to turn a blind eye to and be party to a level of violence that I think would never have been accepted in a place that was not populated by Black people.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about the archival work you did. Specifically, what archives did you visit? What information were you looking for there? What language was a lot of the material in? And in what archives did you find new information that previously was not found in either scholarly or autobiographical books?
Yeah, so the big ones were the Eisenhower Library, which has the White House documents, the National Archives, which has the State Department documents, the Swedish National Library, which has Dag Hammarskjöld's personal papers. And that was actually really rich because it had all the daily and hourly, often, cable traffic back and forth. A lot of the sources were in French. A lot were in English as well. And to give you one example, there was in the National Archives, there was a document that looked to be a State Department document. It was on State Department letterhead, and I didn't think anything of it at the time when I was just scanning it. And then months later, when I looked at the PDF on my computer, a name jumped out at me, and it was the former CIA station chief in Leopoldville who was on his way out, and he, long story short, had this meeting very early on where he's encouraging someone to get rid of Lumumba and fire him. And it was sort of misfiled in State Department archives. So yeah, a lot of archives from different places, but also then, to get the Congolese side, which there are very few archives, that's where I relied on oral histories, interview with the children of Lumumba, for instance, and sort of obscure memoirs from the 60s and 70s written by Congolese politicians.
Yeah. I'm wondering if you could go into a bit more depth on the Congolese side, because the archival evidence is skim and many individuals have been killed or passed away.
Yeah, so that was a lack that I was acutely aware of. And so I tried to make it up for it with, contemporaneous interviews with Congolese actors at the time. And then, as I mentioned, a lot of these figures, those who survived, went on to write memoirs for, small Belgian presses gave their side of the stories. So it was something I was aware of and tried to compensate for as much as possible.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for drawing attention to this period of history. I'm a returned Peace Corps volunteer who attempted to serve the Congolese people during the Mobutu regime, Zaire. In the 80s, there was a book written called With Friends Like These, Who Needs Enemies? I can't recall the author. I'm just wondering what would happen, what would have to occur to cause the US to make better decisions in that regard? Thank you.
That's a tall order. I mean, I think the main problem in supporting Mobutu was this short-term outlook. The idea that at any given moment, the safest decision was to support the pro-American authoritarian leader rather than push for broader, longer-term democratic change. And so I think the key change would have to be widening the time horizon and thinking about decades rather than just weeks and months and a year.
Hi. I was interested that in much of your talk just now, you haven't spoken very much about the Congo's immense mineral wealth, which is of vast importance to so many people in this world and the things that we use. And just wondering how that contributed to all that happened around Lumumba. Were people aware of that wealth, and was that part of what was at play?
You know, to my own surprise, that did not play a big role, as I found in my research. And I think the reason is, at that time, the Congolese economy was very much Belgian dominated. So it would explain a lot of Belgian decisions, but in terms of US policy, it wasn't about minerals or companies or financial interests. It was all about Cold War and Lumumba's unreliable. And so again and again in the cables, you see, you know, references to what the Soviets are supposedly up to, references to Lumumba being erratic and, you know, not a reliable partner, but you barely see anything about financial interests. So I think they weren't actually playing a big role. In contrast, like in Iran and Guatemala, there you had much more of an economic link with the United Fruit Company and the Anglo-American Oil Company. But in Congo, at that point, it wasn't a big factor.
But it would have been a big factor in why the US was supporting Mobutu for so long.
I mean, eventually, Congo did become important for America economically, I think. I mean, I don't want to overstate something about a period I don't know, but back then, it honestly wasn't much of a factor.
Thank you.
Hi, I was wondering if you could speak a bit more on the role of Belgium in this, because I know Belgium was fundamentally and deeply opposed to Lumumba, and I'm curious if the Belgians put pressure on the United States, or if any pressure was needed, or if it was just a case of US and Belgian perceived interests coinciding nicely.
Belgium was constantly trying to pull the United States closer toward its position. They were both NATO allies, and so this was a close European ally. And so the US, in a certain way, was torn between Belgium, its European ally and a former colonial power, and, you know, trying to be on the right side of history in Africa. And Congo, those things came to a head, and it ultimately chose far more in the Belgian direction. As for the role that Belgium itself played, I mean, it's all over the place. Sorry, not meaning scattered, but it's a consistent theme throughout the events I talk about. I mean, and you had many Belgians on the ground. As I mentioned, there were Belgian officers who gave the order to the firing squad that killed Lumumba. But they were also expelled from the country at a certain point, so they had a little bit of a less of an on-the-ground presence than the Americans did. And there's been excellent work on the Belgian role in the Congo Crisis, for instance, Ludo DeWitt's book. But what I tried to do was surface more of the American role, which was extremely significant.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Stuart, and thank you, Elizabeth. If we can give them a round of applause.
Thank you
for your time today.